When a family sold what they could not sow, shame fit like a stone necklace around her throat. The trade was older than anger. It was a habit of hunger disguised as law. In the morning, the quiet smelled of warm bread and wet wool, but beneath it ran the metallic tang of final reckonings, and the air seemed to hold the sound of things being measured. She stood in the doorway while men counted soil and sacks, and the village watched as if it were a ritual too familiar to warrant surprise. The house where Ruth had been born sat low in a hollow, its shutters closed against wind and gossip. Outside, cornfields shimmered like a body breathing in summer. Inside, a child's quilt kept secrets of other winters. The contrast was raw. The land around her looked generous, green, and obstinate, while inside, scarcity had a face and a name. That face was Eli the father, whose hands trembled when he handed the ledger to Amos the trader. The ledger flap made a dry sound like leaves. He did not look at Ruth when the words were spoken. Miriam the sister folded her palms until the knuckles whitened. Ruth felt each name a cold stone that the village could set into a pattern and walk away. She had been told since a girl that stories could bind a household against storm and debt. Her mother told tales that stitched warmth into winter beds. She had learned to make a story taste like bread and keep it for others. The stories had netted food and kind eyes and the small credit a family needed to breathe. But stories are not coin, and the ledger did not read the lines that saved her tongue. Ruth was the kind of young woman whose hands remembered song more readily than prayer. Her hair smelled of starch and ash from washing, and her skin bore the quiet calluses that meant long hours at the churn and the loom. She was called wolfless by some because she had not married into a pack or a household, and that lack sat in the village like a loose stitch. She was shy with strangers and quick with the cadence of old folk tales. People said that in the barn loft she hummed rhymes that held the ghosts of better harvests. She kept a small carved pin, wood smoothed by years, that she pressed to her chest in the dark and recited lines to make the past sleep. When Amos the trader proposed payment in land and grain, and in exchange demanded one to be given to settle the final tally for a season of failure, the air in the kitchen thickened as if the breath itself had been taxed. Backstory was a thread she could feel pulling at her now. As a child, Ruth had watched her mother mend a shirt with the same hand that fed them soup, and told of a queen who gave away half her crown to save a village. The story shaped the girl into a woman who believed sacrifice could be noble. At 12, she had been left to mind Miriam when Eli had taken to the road with a borrowed wagon and little more than a promise to return with seed. The wagon did not return for a year. The neighbors spoke in low voices about misfortune with livestock, about a bad weather that turned seed to rot. At 15, she traded hours at the loom for a few jars of sugar and kept a ledger of favors in a wooden box. Those favors were their invisible currency, and her stories were the receipts. She had learned to weigh words the way merchants weighed grain. 2 of the village boys had once mocked her, saying there was no dowry in rhyme. She had laughed with them then, but the laugh had been thin. The lesson stayed. A story alone would not anchor a roof. Her earliest memory of the town square was of the bell that never tolled above its head without someone looking down with a cheap hat and the hunger of hungry eyes. She could still close her fists and feel the roughness of a rope that had bound a sack of charcoal when she was 10. The rope had a smell she could not forget, cinnamon and tar and smoke. Those early privations braided themselves into resolve. Ruth had an odd tenderness for broken things and a stubborn belief that if she told the right story at the right time, a closed hand would open. That belief was about to be tested. When Amos spoke, it was with a calm, practiced to the point of cruelty. His coat was brushed and his fingers clean, but his voice carried the dust of the routes he traveled. "We settle this in kind," he said. "Land in exchange, grain in exchange, one to serve until the price is quartered." He signed with a mark that was neat as a prayer. Ruth heard the words, but not their meaning until they landed. "Who will it be?" asked Harlan the foreman, his voice a rasp of straw.
Faces turned toward Ruth as if the village had become a single eye, assessing which of its little things could be spared. "No," said Eli at first, a whisper that did not hide the shame in it. "We will work until the soil returns its due." Miriam reached out and gripped Ruth's wrist. "We will double down the days," she said. "We will mend and sow and pray." That plea had the sound of a child's prayer. The trading men shook their heads with a softness that was the sound of doors closing. "It is the law of our agreement," Amos said, and the ledger slapped the table like a folded coin. "You cannot hide a debt in stories." He pointed to a clause that had the solidity of a ghost. Ruth felt air move
from her chest. The world shrank to the width between ledger and mouth. The selection was quick and cruel in execution. Men came with ropes and long boots and a horse used to pavement of markets. Reuben, a neighbor whose family owed another favor to Ruth's, tried to argue. "There must be another way," he said, but his voice broke at the third word, and no one met his gaze. The villagers circled and watched. Clara, the midwife, clutched her shawl, and a child cried somewhere in a house down the lane. The ritual of taking had become part of the way they greeted misfortune, minds dulled to the logic of survival. Ruth smelled horse sweat and fresh straw when they pushed her out the door. The sun was pale, like bread baked too briefly. She stepped into the lane and felt something in her chest tighten, an old muscle learning the motion of grief. They led her through rows of houses where curtains were clenched like teeth. They marched past the mill where the wheel turned and threw up a dust that tasted of iron. Harlan walked just behind, his boots scuffing. Ansel, the community head, watched from the lane with his hands folded. He was both a comfort and a ruler. His brow carried the strain of seasons and the ring of authority. He said nothing as she passed. His silence could be kind or a verdict. That uncertainty gnawed at her. The journey to the place Amos called the manor was a slow change of textures. Soil gave way to gravel to a road that had been engineered to persist. The trader gave her a plain dress to wear, and the seam strained at the shoulder where the cut was wrong. "You will be present at the counting," Amos told her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "And you will tell us a story in the evening for those who trade here. Your voice will settle what the ledger cannot." There was admiration in the offer, as if her story had become an asset in their economy of shame. The cart bumped, and the world outside slid, horizon by horizon, like pages turning. They arrived at a house of different light. The manor had a low, wide porch that smelled of beeswax and carved wood. Servos moved with slow authority there, and the air held a coolness that felt like old reputations. The house had a room that was used for guests, tall windows and a hearth that kept an eye on everyone. Ruth knew then that she had been transferred from one form of obligation to another, like a seed being moved from poor soil to rich but foreign ground. Her senses widened. The room smelled of iron polish and a faint sweetness of pipe tobacco. The other servants looked at her as a curiosity, as if she were a new addition to a collection of small miseries. Someone named Rebecca touched a and smiled without teeth. "You will learn," she said, "or you will be taught." The first night they bathed her. It was a ritual in neutral hands. The water smelled of rosemary and something herbal that stiffened the skin into a new identity. The wash removed the dust, but left a trace of humiliation. A modest dress was pressed and given. A collar of plain rope was tied around her wrist as a mark of service. The seamstress who did the work was named Ruthia, a niece of Ansel, who measured with professional indifference and called her by the wrong name until corrected. "We will dress you to fit," Ruthia said, but her fingers lingered on the carved pin at Ruth's breast. "Where did you get a thing like that?" she asked. "From my mother," Ruth answered, and she did not add that it was all that had been left of a promise. That night the manor hummed with a life not her own. Servants traded small news in low voices. "The leader is expected," Harlan whispered as he passed. "Ansel will be at the count," Reuben muttered. The word leader carried with it weight and a secrecy like a room with a locked door. In that house, things happened by custom and by choice, and both were heavy. At dawn she was brought into a chamber where the counting took place. A long table was strewn with scales and jars and bundles of account, and the smell of grain pressed the air. Men in neat shirts sat with quills and a ledger that had the authority of statute. Amos looked pleased with the exchange, as if he had done righteousness. "This is the way of contracts," he said, and his voice slicked like oil. Then the door opened, and Ansel entered. He wore no robe of power, only a plain shirt and a vest, but the room changed when he came in. His hair was salt and neat. His hands were broad and calloused from years of labor turned into governance. There was a quiet about him that was not cold. He observed the ledger as if reading a story in a strange language, and looked at Ruth not as property, but as a complication. He was not a king, not a man with crown or sword, but among them he had a gravity, like one who could balance the weight of obligations and still choose mercy. When he addressed the room, his voice was low and steady. "Tell me why this must be done," he said, and the question itself made room for another answer than ledger and law. The first sustained conversation between Ruth and Ansel happened not in the bright eyes of the counting room, but in a shadowed corridor lined with jars of seed, with the smell of hay and old dust. It began with a simple exchange that bent toward something neither had expected. He asked her about her story, and she answered. His questions were steady and patient, and she found herself giving more than the simple tale. The talk lengthened and deepened into a riddle he posed, then returned to like a pebble in his mouth. "What do you give to the ground to make it keep?" he asked. She replied with a line about seed and shame, and told him in fragments the tapestry of her life. There were pauses, and each pause was a place where the corridor could have closed or opened. They spoke at length, and their exchange threaded curiosity into caution, comfort into distrust. There were 8 exchanges that first evening that shaped the pattern of what would come. He would ask, she would hesitate, she would answer, and each time his reply carried a kindness that confused the economy of her world. "I have seen trades in other valleys," he said. "People barter daughters like goods and call it law. Is there no anger in you?" he asked. "Anger does not keep a family warm," she said. "What keeps us warm is bread, and what buys bread is work and patience." "And your patience," he asked softly, "is what brought you to my table." She could not decide if his tone was condemnation or compassion. "Do you think I wanted this?" she said. "No," he replied, "but wanting and surviving are not the same thing." The corridor smell of straw and iron wrapped around the words they could not know how to say. The small riddle he offered had more sting than it seemed. "When a field takes from you, what does it leave behind that can still be turned into something else?" he asked. And she answered with a parable about a widow who sown stars and reaped bread. He smiled then, a brief sadness that made him humane. "You tell stories to make the impossible plausible," he said. "Does that mean you believe them?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "Stories keep the shape of courage," she told him, "even when the hands that start them are trembling." He looked at her as if he had hoped for a different kind of proof, and found instead an honesty that unsettled him. That first meeting established both a riddle and a tether. He was the leader who could have been the predator, and he was the man who, instead of closing the ledger with a finality, asked questions that hinted at possible ways to alter the account. The manor had rules, but Ansel had the power to reinterpret them. He did not promise to upend the ledger, but his attention felt like a blade that could cut in new directions. The days that followed settled into a routine where Ruth learned the architecture of the manor by chores and by small kindnesses. She cleaned the pantry and carried pails from the well, and, in the afternoons, was tasked with simple tale-telling for the workers of the estate. Her voice became a commodity, but not in the way Amos had imagined. She moved through the library that Ansel kept, a narrow room under the stair, with shelves of old ledgers and hymnals, with scraps of poems tucked in jars of seeds. It smelled of paper and beeswax, and something like the scent of an old garment left in sun. On nights she was given a corner by the kitchen and told to recount a tale, not for the trade, but because someone wanted to listen. Rebecca brought a cup of thin tea and sat with a kind of dry curiosity. Harlan would remain outside the kitchen door, letting his boots cool and listening as his day unwound. In the library, Ansel showed her a stack of books bound in rough linen, and a small chest with names carved into the lid. "This is a place where we keep things we do not wish to lose to winter," he said. He taught her how to smooth parchment and how to store a story in a safe place. He gave her a small gift one evening, a simple ring with a carved grain on it, and said it was a token for someone whose words helped the land. The ring smelled of metal and oil and fit her finger like a question. "It is not a collar," he said, "but a promise that you may be heard in a different currency." The offered gift shifted their exchange from ledger to language. Their conversations multiplied into a pattern of discovery. They spoke of seeds and of sermons, of law and of the small laws villages kept to remain intact. He argued for precedent and for mercy in a voice that showed he had weighed both. She pushed him with the stories that had sustained her family and the village. Between them, the bookcases witnessed a slow knitting of respect. Reuben and Clara listened to some of the sessions and brought small reports to the lane. Ruth found herself sharing secrets she had never given anyone, and in return, Ansel shared a scarred ledger page with margins annotated in his neat hand that told of a previous season when his choice had altered more than a field. The giving of the ring, the secret library, and the long talks changed the ledger from immutable to negotiable in her imagination. There were small discoveries: how Rebecca had once been promised to a man she did not love, how Harlan kept a soft ache for the daughter he had lost to fever, how Amos had once been a soldier and kept a fear of water like a small bone in his chest. These revelations made the estate feel less like a machine and more like a village with its own scars. They also planted seeds of empathy in Ruth that shifted the landscape. When a man named Jacob, who had come as a messenger from a nearby valley with news of a tariff and a plague of locusts, spoke with shock at the trade Ruth had endured, Ansel listened with only a tightness in his jaw. "We cannot solve every sorrow," he said, "but we can choose how we meet each one." A ritual of washing and naming at the manor was technical and precise. They measured water to a line into household service, signed the ledger that tracked duty, and tied a loop to the wrist to signify the rotation of tasks. The ritual lasted a strict number of minutes and was recorded in a bound sheet. It was at once efficient and ceremonial, a process that stripped one identity and stitched another. The deeper problem came when the village heard that Ruth now told stories for the manor and that she had been given a ring that resembled a promise. Rumors unfolded along the lanes like loose straw. Some thought she had been bought outright and was now a sycophant to the new orders. Others whispered that she had been favored because Ansel had a weakness for the soft-voiced. The community that had once watched without moving now spoke in clusters. Eli's head bowed each time someone mentioned Ruth in public, like a man made small by the act of naming his child. In the quiet hours, between chores and between the whisperings, Ruth felt the tug of an impossible desire. She wanted to change the ledger not only in numbers but in meaning. She imagined renegotiating the law of exchange and creating room for mercy in a system built for accounting. She began to write, a clandestine habit of inscribing stories onto the margins of a scrap of linen, folding them like small seed parcels and hiding them in the chest under the library steps. The act of writing felt like planting. The conflict sharpened when Amos returned with a new proposition. His eyes had the hunger of someone who had been to markets and found them full of opportunities. "We could trade more efficiently," he said to Ansel in the counting room, "or we could sell the whole of that little plot to a merchant and move the people to other fields."
He gestured subtly toward Ruth's family by naming them. One fewer mouth, one less debt. There was a practical currency to his logic. If the manor pays a sum for the land, we can split it and be done. He tapped a ledger. The room smelled suddenly of apple and old money. Ansel's reply was deliberate. "We will not force more from them than necessary," he said. "We will not turn human bodies into a balance sheet." The sentence dropped with moral weight and with an implication of choice. "But if the law deems it necessary, we will follow the law and look for ameliorations where we can."
Harlan stood with his hands clasped as if holding a secret. Reuben swallowed. Ruth listened and felt as if the ledger were being tested for elasticity. The question of who Ruth was to be as they counted changed into a request for her consent. Amos expected compliance. Ansel expected negotiation. The villagers expected spectacle. They all expected her to be as the ledger predicted. She surprised them by crafting a counteroffer in voice and in deed. She would, she proposed, tell a story each market day to bring in trades that favored the village. She would teach the children in the lanes to mend cloth and to recite bargains in a way that made them less likely to be chosen as offerings. She would, in short, use her voice to shift the economy, to become an asset of a different sort. The first true tension came when the market day turned into a test. Amos brought buyers to sample the manor's produce, and he invited merchants to see the work of the servants. He expected Ruth to be a demonstration of obedience. Instead, with Harlan's quiet help, she organized a small evening where she told the story of a widow who traded an old bowl for a patch of ground and ended up being the heart of an entire village. The story drew tears and then offers of trade where the villagers could sell their wares without losing a person. One merchant, named Elias from the river town, listened and then offered to buy half the grain stash at a fair price that would settle a part of the debt without giving up land. The merchant had a soft voice and calloused palms and seemed honest in a way that the folding ledgers did not capture. The moment was a small victory, but victory pricked at the older wound. Amos argued that this was circumvention. "You are undermining the agreement," he said. "You are shifting the expected outcome." Harlan countered, and in that heated exchange, Ansel's stance revealed its complexity. He sought legal precedent. He asked for patience. He sought ways to keep peace. The argument swelled, and small alliances formed. Rebecca stood with Ansel. Reuben stood with Ruth. Clara pleaded with a kind of maternal logic. A public humiliation came when someone from the village, a man named Jacob, accused Ruth of flattering the buyers with false tales to obtain charity. The accusation was meant to wound. It forced Ruth into silence and then back into a place of defense. She stood on a low stool in the square and told another story, one that had no flourish and no ornaments, about a mother who had been asked to hand over her child to a creditor, and the secret way the mother made the creditor laugh and forget the demand. The village listened, and the merchant Eli, the riverman, placed a coin on the stool and said plainly that he would buy grain enough to feed 2 families a season. The action changed accusation into an awkward gratitude that did not undo the shame but softened it. The deeper conflict came as an internal struggle inside Ruth. She had to decide whether to cling to the role the ledger and the market carved for her, or to take risk and insist on a redefinition of what a person owed. Ansel became the mirror for this debate. He would at times lean close and ask blunt questions about whether she wanted the ring to be a shackle or an amulet of promise. "Freedom is not always the absence of obligation," he said. "Sometimes freedom is the ability to choose which obligations to carry." She thought of the carved pin at her breast and of the writing she had hidden in the chest under the stairs. The choice felt like deciding whether to change the grain into bread or to let it remain silence waiting for a season. There was a moment of almost acceptance that hung like fog over the lane. Ansel invited her to speak at a gathering of the manor and the nearby farmers, a kind of reconciliation session to determine how best to change the system of debts that had been onerous that spring. He offered her a small power to convene and to propose alternative ways for debt to be repaid. She rehearsed the words and the measures, measuring how they would land on a ledger and how they would land on a child's palm. She almost agreed to his terms, which would allow a partial return to the village with obligations restructured. She almost accepted because the math of survival had a persuasive voice. The reveal that broke the almost happened in a daylight scrape of panic. Someone snapped a picture of a ledger page that had Ansel's annotations and sent it into the lane, where it was sown into gossip and suspicion. The page was read aloud at the well by men who did not know how to interpret marginalia with mercy. Words turned into charge, and charge into betrayal. It was said that Ansel had been negotiating to buy land and keep Ruth as an ornament to show the manor's benevolence. Voices rose and then sank into something cold. Miriam wept in the kitchen, and Eli covered his face with his hands and wept too. Reuben slammed his fist into a table and cursed. The misunderstanding was vivid and immediate. Shame worked fast. In the heated hush that followed, Ruth felt the old sensation of being a commodity pressed against her ribs. The misinterpretation hardened the village's view and forced Ansel into a corner of his own making. He tried to explain, his words stitched and frayed. "You have heard only parts," he said in a public meeting. "You have not listened to the whole. I have been seeking a lawful path." But law did not have the sweetness of a story told properly. People wanted the simple narrative of being wronged and of righting harm with the same blunt instrument that committed it. A faction called for her return to settle accounts under the old terms, or else for the manor to give more to the village to account for the humiliation. The proposals grew louder than context. That night, Ruth packed a small bundle of linen scraps with saved stories and left a note for Miriam. She walked to the place by the river where reeds bent in a tired applause. Alone she sat and thought of the carved pin at her breast and the ring on her finger, and wondered if she had been traded in more ways than one. The river sounded like an argument with itself. In the dark she slept and woke with the image of the ledger again and again. She felt both outrage and a terrible tiredness of being watched. Exile came as a public act of cleansing. The village elders, with Ansel present and with Amos ledger evidence, decided it was better for the village's reputation to return Ruth to her family and to have her father sign a bond that would commit to tighter labor for 2 seasons. It was a legal spectacle. She was called to the green, and the crowd formed a ring. Jacob shouted accusations. Rebekah tried to speak in Ruth's defense, but was drowned out. The law of the ledgers and the law of the village decided she must leave the manor. The ruling felt less like an exoneration and more like a reassigning of shame. She left with Miriam holding her hand and Eli following. The walk back was quiet, and the fields seemed to watch her as if they could read her story. The house was the same, but not. A table that once accepted their simple meals now looked like a bar where debts were paid. She sat in a corner, and a silence formed that had the taste of waiting for a verdict. Ansel came quietly one midnight and left a small folded paper slipped under the door. It contained a sentence written in his careful hand. It said he had tried to bend the account and that he hoped she would believe that he had not purchased her consent. The sentence was thin consolation and a heavier accusation because it implicated her in his choice to act. The wound widened when the village pronounced its verdict with the finality of a public hand. Harlan said they had been naive to trust strangers. Reuben said they had been fools to think a leader could alter the ledger without consequence. The community did not know what to do with the new knowledge that someone in the manor had tried to help. That ambiguity hardened into exile. Ruth felt as if she had shed a skin that should have stayed with her. The small chest under the stairs remained empty of the ring, and the carved pin felt heavier than when she had worn it. She left again. Months passed with an absence like a slow winter. She miscarried hope as seasons fell away. Then came the return that no one expected. The county planned a wedding as part of a treaty between nearby estates aimed at securing a mutual defense against raiders and blight. The manor announced the event with fanfare and with a list of invited townspeople. The village gave the invitation to Ruth as if it were both an honor and a public advertisement that she had been redeemed. She wondered if it was a trap or a test. The wedding day was set with a banqueting table under a tent of linens white as a kind of fallacy. The manor lighting made faces seem carved from old wood. Servos moved like constellations around a central gravity well called the leader. Amish hosted merchants with faces glazed in polite greed. The community dressed in their Sunday best, though many wondered if their best would be seen. The bride and groom were set to join houses and lands. The treaty would be sealed with bread and song and ceremony. It was the perfect stage for spectacle. The crisis came with a subtlety that made it worse. As people gathered, an attempt was made on the groom's life by a hooded figure. A blade that was meant for a man in power almost struck him in the chest. Panic became a wave that could have swept away the tent. Reuben saw the glint of metal and lunged, catching the sleeve of the assailant. The hood fell, and the attacker was revealed to be a youth from a rival valley, a boy whose family had lost land in a previous season. Shots rang, and the music stopped like a stitched thread being cut. The crowd recoiled, and the sound of breath filled the space. In the sudden chaos, Ruth moved as if involuntarily. She ran to the tent with a speed that made some remark that she was born for flight, and yet now moved to shield. She pushed between the assailant and the groom, and in that thin instant, a second blade came down. Ruth took the blow meant for another. The wound was clean, and the blood was bright in the white of the linens. The world condensed to the thudding of her heart and the smell of iron, and then to the whisper of hands pulling the attacker away. People screamed and then fell into silence, like a pond that had been struck. In that silence she felt Ansel's hands on her, steady and sure, and the roar of the crowd felt like a chorus that made meanings shift. The public moment of crisis forced the ledger to a point of moral clarity. The bridegroom survived, and the assailant was detained. The groom's father, a man with the power to sway neighboring councils, demanded answers. Ansel stepped forward in the center of the tent and spoke with a voice that commanded.
Attention, not by raising, but by cutting cleanly. He told the story of Ruth's service and of the way she had used voice and story to stave off worse trades. She did not belong to any ledger, he said. She belonged to the village and to no one else. She gave her life for another, and in doing so made the choices for us. The audience listened as if to a verdict. The action and Ansel's speech changed the arc of public opinion in a way that no private negotiation could. The guard Reuben and Harlan had intervened to detain the attacker, while Amish looked on with a face of animal fury transformed by confusion. Rebecca fainted into Clara's arms. Eli cried aloud as if a dam had burst. Miriam shouted Ruth's name over and over. People in the crowd did not know yet what to make of a woman who had repelled an attack by offering her body. Some called it heroism, others called it tragedy. News of the wound spread like a stain of color. In the aftermath, the manor's ledger of obligations was rewritten in public. The bridegroom's father insisted on compensation for the attempted assassination. In a move that surprised everyone, he insisted that the compensation be directed at restoring the village, at redistributing land so families no longer had to trade people to pay debt. He argued, not out of simple benevolence, but because a community that produced stability was a safer neighbor than one that traded its members away. He used his authority to push the manor to secure parcels of land for families at fair prices, and to set up a fund for those who had been sacrificed in the past. It was an institutional change that had the smell of revolution in it, but clothed in courtesy. Ansel stood by Ruth as medics attended her wound. He refused to allow a decorative shroud or a silent removal. "She will be given the choice," he told the gathering. "She will choose her path." That simple insistence shifted the ledger again. The public clamor made private negotiations impossible. The village could not quietly reassign shame. A new measure was set in place with legal witnesses, and Ruth found herself at the center of a decision that would define not only her life, but the village's practices. In the days that followed, the wound became a symbol. People who had once turned away now brought herbs and food. Eli stooped without the weight of shame in his shoulders in the same way a man unpacks a bundle. Miriam read aloud pages from the chest of linen stories that Ruth had stored. Rebecca and Clara organized a list of those who would need land security. Amos, seeing that the tide had turned, attempted to stitch an apology that looked like profit hedged against loss. He offered his contacts and a share of goods to the village and sought to write his name into the ledger of courtesy. The act was opportunistic, but it helped set up an easier path to change. Ruth's choice was public. She could accept an offer from the bridegroom's father to move to the river town with security and a wage, or return to the village under the new terms that redistributed plots and established a communal fund to prevent future trades of flesh for grain. She could also demand that Ansel's manor officially adopt a charter forbidding trades of persons for debt. She chose the last. She stood in the square with the heady smell of straw and apple and read aloud a statement she had written in careful hand during nights of wound and reflection. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as it went on. She spoke of dignity and of markets that must answer to more than coin. She demanded structural change. The legal men present recorded her statement in triplicate and witnesses signed. The change ushered in was both material and symbolic. Land was redistributed in measured parcels. A fund called the Grain Promise was set up to buy time for families whose reserves ran low. Ansel created a registry to oversee trade agreements and to ensure transparency. Amos grumbled but also adapted, seeing a respectable market for traded goods where agreements were clear and human lives were not counted as one line in a ledger. Harlan and Rebecca helped train villagers in better accounting practices. Reuben and Clara organized a cooperative that would make bartering more equitable. Jacob returned to his lane with a new respect and an embarrassed apology. There was a scene of public transformation. At a banquet where the new charter was read, Ansel stood before both manor and village and placed the ring he had once offered onto Ruth's finger again, but this time not as a symbol of possession, but as a sign of covenant. "You are not mine," he said. "You are a keeper of stories and a keeper of change." His hand lingered for a beat that was not a claim, but companionship. The village watched, and some cried. The bridegroom's father announced that the treaty had been signed in such a way that neighboring counties would take notice. The event felt like a theater with stakes unimagined. The transformation was partly physical and partly metaphysical. Where once a young woman could be traded for grain, now there was an ordinance to guard against that fate. Where once the manor served as a repository for bargains sealed without consent, now its registry recorded the names of all agreements and required that any trade involving persons be scrutinized and publicly justified. The ledger continued to exist, but with new entries and new witnesses. The change did not erase suffering, but it reduced the ease with which suffering could be turned into policy. The epilogue followed the shape of seasons. 1 month later, the wounds were tended and the village moved into autumn with a cautious hope. Ruth walked the lane with a new steadiness. Children ran past and called her name without a smallness in their voices. Eli went to market with a face that had lost a portion of its shame. The communal fund had already helped 2 houses buy seed, and the first meeting of the registry recorded the names of those who would be protected. Amos had adjusted his ledgers and even invested in giving fair prices to the village on occasion. For Ruth, the ring on her finger felt less a weight and more a tool, a reminder of the night she stepped between blade and another life. She still dreamed of the carved pin her mother had given her and kept a story in the chest under the library steps for the winter nights.
3 months later, the new ordinance had ripples beyond the valley. A neighboring town sent a delegation led by Elias the merchant, who had first offered fair coin at the market. He came to report that the model had inspired them to restructure some of their barter practices. Ruth attended the meeting and read aloud a new tale about gardens that fed more than a house. The story was recorded and passed along. The Grain Promise Fund had dispersed enough to secure planting for several families, and Ansel had insisted that the manor open its storehouses during harsh weather without requiring human collateral. Miriam had started a small school where children learned to read ledgers and stories alike, and Rebecca organized a sewing circle that provided new income. The village was not transformed into utopia, but it was more humane, more just in the particular ways that mattered. 6 months later, the change had taken deeper root. The registry was functioning and had become a model of transparency. The bridegroom's father had returned to the manor to plant an orchard that would feed community measures and had the ceremonial ribbons cut by children chosen from the village. Ruth had a modest house plot near the river, and her stories had become part of the local schoolroom curriculum. She had given birth 6 months after the wound to a child with hair the color of straw and eyes that remembered the light. The child became a living proof of the possibility of new beginnings. Ansel visited often, and in private, they spoke of future plans to create an archive where the chest under the library steps would be displayed alongside the manor ledgers as a symbol of balance. The epilogue closed with the symbol of a carved pin placed on a shelf in the archive next to the ledger, the two objects finally allowed to coexist. The village had not forgotten the cost or the shock. It had not erased Amos from memory, but it had made him accountable. The law remained a living thing that now required witnesses and compassion. The child grew, and the Song of Ruth became part of the village hymnals. If this
story reached you in the way it reached those who came to the tent and watched the linen stain, you felt the shift from private ledger to public conscience. If you felt anger at the trade that nearly took a life and felt relief at the way people finally answered with structure as well as compassion, you are not alone. Many of us hold stories like Ruth's as proof that systems can be changed when enough people insist on different terms. If one sentence held you, begin your comment with "my line favorite" and paste it below. Or tell me a different ending you would have chosen for Ruth. Which name in the story surprised you most? Rebecca, Harlan, Reuben, Elias, Amos, Miriam, Eli, or Ansel? Tell us in the comments, and I will pin some of your lines in the next episode. Your reactions shape how future episodes unfold, and I read them for ideas that become bonus scenes on the Patreon page. Now we return to the barn loft, where a new story is being written about how a village learns to measure justice and not just grain. As a final note, if this episode moved you and you want to follow the series, consider subscribing. Each subscription helps support more stories that dig into the ledger lines where law meets life. The next chapter will explore the archive as a site of memory and the way the manor and village continue to negotiate the meaning of ownership and belonging. She had lost land and gained voice. The village had lost naive compliance and gained laws that ached with care. The carved pin gleamed in the new archive like a secret that had become a rule. If stories changed the ledger, then sometimes the ledger changed a life. Stories change hearts, and sometimes a heart is what changes the story.